In late May of 1940, Britain was not losing the war slowly, it was about to lose it all, at once, not in London, not in the skies. Above the Channel, but on a narrow stretch of sand in northern France, where an entire army was being pushed toward the sea, the British expeditionary force sent to defend Europe now stood trapped with its back against the water, surrounded, outnumbered. And running out of time, Germany's campaign in the West had unfolded faster than anyone expected, while Allied commanders prepared for another long grinding war. German forces struck with speed, precision, and surprise. Armored divisions punched through the Ardennes, an area dismissed as impassable. French defenses collapsed. Before they could react, communications failed, command chains broke, and within days, German troops reached the English Channel, slicing the Allied front into what followed was not a battle but a collapse. British, French, and Belgian units were forced into a continuous retreat. Roads became rivers of abandoned vehicles. Supplies were dumped to move faster. Units lost contact with headquarters and with each other, and by the third week of May, the Allied armies in the north were no longer retreating. They were being herded, driven relentlessly toward a single point on the map, the port of Dunkirk. By the time the survivors reached the coast, nearly 340,000 soldiers were packed into a shrinking pocket of land. The geography offered no protection. Flat beaches stretched for miles, leaving men fully exposed to air attack. The port facilities were already in ruins, and large ships could not safely dock. Soldiers formed endless lines that reached into the freezing water, standing for hours waiting for evacuation that might never come above them. German aircraft roared overhead, bombing the harbor, the beaches, and the roads leading out of town. Fires burned across Dunkirk, sending columns of black smoke into the sky, visible far inland. For the men on the ground it felt like the end. They had no heavy weapons, little food, almost no air cover, and nowhere left to run. Many believed capture or death was inevitable across the Channel. British leaders understood exactly what was at stake. The British Expeditionary Force was not just another army, it was the backbone of Britain's military power. If it was destroyed, Britain would have no trained force to defend the homeland. There would be no army to resist invasion, no strength to continue the war, and perhaps no reason to do so. Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, faced the most dangerous crisis of his political life. Inside his government, voices were already calling for negotiations, arguing that without the army the war was lost. Churchill knew that Dunkirk would decide everything. The fate of Britain, the fate of Europe, and perhaps the fate of the war itself. On the beaches, the soldiers knew none of this. They knew only exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Many had marched and fought for days without sleep. Equipment was abandoned, not out of cowardice, but necessity. Rifles, artillery, vehicles, anything that slowed movement was left behind. Discipline bent under pressure, but did not break. Units stayed together. Officers tried to maintain order even as bombs fell around them. German forces continued to close in from all sides. Armored units advanced steadily from the south, and West infantry followed, securing territory, capturing prisoners, and tightening the noose. From the east, Belgian resistance collapsed, opening new avenues of attack. From the air, the Luftwaffe attacked almost without interruption, and from a purely military perspective, the outcome appeared inevitable. The Allied forces were trapped. Their escape routes were narrow and exposed, and German superiority in armor and air power was overwhelming. Many German commanders believed the final destruction of the British army was only a matter of days. Some believed it would end the war in the West entirely, yet beneath the surface of apparent German triumph, uncertainty existed. German panzer divisions had advanced rapidly and were beginning to show signs of mechanical strain. Supply lines stretched thin. Commanders disagreed sharply over how to finish the campaign. Some urged an immediate push to crush the enemy at Dunkirk. Others warned of overextension, terrain risks, and unforeseen complications. The German High Command faced a decision that would determine not just the outcome of the campaign, but the direction of the entire war. Meanwhile, in Britain, naval planners considered a gamble born of desperation an evacuation across the Channel using every vessel that could float: warships, merchant ships, fishing boats, and civilian craft would all be pressed into service. It was an operation without precedent. The waters were narrow but deadly, exposed to constant air attack, and even the most optimistic estimates suggested only a fraction of the trapped soldiers could be saved. But there was no alternative, as Allied troops waited on the beaches. Time became the most valuable weapon of all. Every hour mattered, every delay meant another chance to live, and what none of them could possibly know was that time was about to be handed to them, not by courage, not by strength, but by a decision made inside the German command, a decision that would pause the advance, a decision that would give Britain the space to breathe, and a decision that would become one of the most controversial and consequential orders of the Second World War, an order given just as the British Army stood on the edge of extinction. On the morning of May 24th, 1940, as British soldiers waited helplessly on the beaches of Dunkirk, something extraordinary happened on the other side of the front. German armored divisions received an order that made little sense to the men on the ground. The tanks that had driven relentlessly across France were told to stop advancing. There was no retreat, no regrouping, no clear explanation, simply a command to hold position for nearly 3 days. The most powerful striking force in Europe remained stationary while their enemy stood trapped in front of them. This instruction soon became known as the Halt Order, and it would change the course of the war. At the moment it was issued, German forces were closer to complete victory than at any other time in the conflict. Panzer units had smashed through Allied defenses, reached the Channel, and sealed off the escape routes of the British Expeditionary Force. From a purely military standpoint, the final move seemed obvious: destroy the enemy where they stood. Yet the order came down from the highest levels of command, and even seasoned officers struggled to understand it. Some believed it was a temporary pause, others assumed it would be lifted within hours. But the hours passed and the tanks did not move. The delay was not insignificant. It occurred at the exact moment when time mattered most for the trapped Allied soldiers. Every additional hour meant another chance to evacuate. Another ship crossing the Channel, another group pulled away from the beaches inside the German command structure. Explanations for the Halt Order varied and sometimes conflicted. One widely accepted theory centers on Adolf Hitler himself, who had developed a deep respect for armored forces after their successes earlier in the campaign, but also feared losing them unnecessarily. The terrain around Dunkirk was flat and marshy, crisscrossed by canals, rivers, and flooded fields. Hitler believed such ground posed a serious risk to tanks, which could become bogged down or immobilized, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack. Another powerful influence was Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, who assured Hitler that German air power alone could destroy the trapped Allied forces. Göring saw Dunkirk as an opportunity to prove the decisive role of the Air Force and secure personal prestige by delivering a victory without further involvement from the army. Hitler agreed, believing the Luftwaffe could finish the job while preserving the tanks for future operations, yet there were other less obvious factors at play. German supply lines were stretched thin, panzer units had advanced at breakneck speed and were experiencing mechanical, where fuel shortages and maintenance problems, commanders worried that pushing forward without proper support could lead to chaos or expose the flanks to unexpected counterattacks. Some generals argued for caution, insisting the enemy was already defeated and could be eliminated at leisure. Others strongly disagreed, insisting that hesitation risked squandering a historic opportunity. The result was confusion layered upon confidence. German commanders knew they were winning but disagreed on how to secure the final blow. While debates unfolded at headquarters, the battlefield remained eerily still. From the perspective of the trapped soldiers, the sudden reduction in ground pressure felt almost unreal. German aircraft continued to attack, but the feared armored assault did not come. British officers initially suspected a trap, expecting the pause to end at any moment, yet the pause stretched on, and with it hope began to grow. Naval planners seized the opportunity. Operation Dynamo, which had been considered a desperate last resort, was now fully activated. Destroyers ferried troops from the harbour while smaller vessels moved closer to shore. Civilian boats, fishing trawlers, and private yachts crossed the channel again and again, pulling men from the water under fire. Each hour saved by the Halt Order translated directly into lives preserved. By the second day of the pause, thousands of soldiers were being evacuated daily. German field commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Reports were sent questioning the logic of the delay. Requests were made to resume the advance, but approval was slow and fragmented. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, failed to deliver the decisive blow it had promised. Weather conditions limited air operations. Smoke from burning Dunkirk obscured targets, and British fighter aircraft provided more resistance than expected. Bombers inflicted heavy damage, but could not stop the evacuation. The very confidence that led German leaders to pause now began to undermine their success. Time continued to slip away when the Halt Order was finally lifted. The moment had already passed. German tanks resumed their advance, but the window for total victory was closing. Defenses had been strengthened, evacuation routes improved, and the remaining Allied forces were more organized than before the pause. What had been a trapped army was rapidly turning into a rescued one. Historians continue to debate whether the Halt Order was a calculated political gesture, a strategic misjudgment, or a simple case of overconfidence. Some suggest Hitler hoped Britain would negotiate peace and did not want to destroy its army entirely. Others argue it was the result of competing egos and poor coordination at the highest levels of command. There is no single document that provides a definitive answer, and perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the decision so significant. The Halt Order was not the result of weakness, but of victory. It emerged from a position of strength and assumed that time was irrelevant. Germany had conquered Europe in weeks and believed it could afford to wait. Dunkirk proved that time can be the most decisive factor in war by stopping when they should have advanced. German leaders transformed a certain victory into a strategic failure. A pause lasting less than 72 hours altered the balance of power in Europe and gave Britain something it desperately needed: a chance to survive. The Halt Order remains one of the most debated decisions of the Second World War, even decades later. Historians and military analysts continue to argue over who was responsible and what the true motive might have been at the center of the debate stands. Adolf Hitler, the Führer, whose decisions shaped the fate of nations Hitler had been closely monitoring. The rapid advance of German armored divisions since the invasion of France, he was aware of the incredible speed and efficiency with which his panzer corps had moved through the Ardennes and into northern France. Yet, as the German forces approached Dunkirk, he made a decision that seemed counterintuitive. He instructed his tanks to halt to allow the Luftwaffe to finish the destruction of the trapped Allied forces. Hitler had concerns about the terrain around Dunkirk. He feared that marshy fields, canals, and flooded lowlands could immobilize his tanks, leaving them vulnerable to counterattacks. He also believed that the German air force alone could achieve a decisive victory without the risk of committing ground troops to potentially hazardous conditions. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had assured Hitler that the Air Force could destroy the entire British expeditionary force from the air, a promise that reinforced Hitler's confidence in issuing the order. Göring saw Dunkirk as an opportunity to demonstrate the supremacy of air power and secure prestige within the Nazi hierarchy. He argued that by holding back the tanks, the Luftwaffe would gain the glory of a victory achieved entirely by aerial might. Yet the situation was more complex than a simple dispute between Hitler and Göring. Within the German high command, there were multiple voices, each offering contradictory advice. Some generals argued for an immediate push to crush the enemy while they were still trapped on the beaches. Others cautioned that overextending armored units without adequate reconnaissance or logistical support could lead to disaster. Supply lines were stretched, mechanical failures were mounting, and fuel was limited. The debate was heated. Confident generals clashed with cautious ones, each believing that their view represented the path to ultimate victory. In addition to military reasoning, there are those who suggest political considerations played a role. Hitler may have hoped that Britain would negotiate peace if its army was left largely intact. Destroying the British expeditionary force might have provoked Britain into fighting with greater determination. Some historians argue that allowing the evacuation could be seen as an olive branch of sorts, an opportunity to create favorable conditions for potential diplomatic talks. The Luftwaffe's inability to fully destroy the evacuation convoys also complicated the situation. Heavy smoke from fires burning across Dunkirk obscured targets, and British fighter aircraft provided more resistance than anticipated. Bombing raids inflicted damage but could not halt the evacuation. The combination of political calculation, military caution, and personal ambition created a perfect storm that led to the order to halt the advance from the perspective of the trapped soldiers on the beaches. The reasons behind the Halt Order were unknowable. All they could see was a sudden reduction in the pace of the enemy's advance. Day after day, the tanks did not move. The pause created a fragile hope in the hearts of soldiers who had nearly given up hope. Every hour of delay was a chance to reach the relative safety of the evacuation vessels. It was as if time itself had become an ally. The British naval and army commanders recognized the opportunity. Immediately Operation Dynamo shifted into full execution. The pause allowed destroyers to dock multiple times a day, while smaller craft moved closer to shore, pulling soldiers from the water under the constant threat of bombs and strafing fire. Civilian vessels joined the effort. Yachts, fishing boats, and merchant ships all navigated the dangerous waters, bringing men to safety. In military terms, the Halt Order was extraordinary. It demonstrated how decisions made far from the battlefield could have monumental consequences, in this case a pause not driven by necessity, but by a combination of risk assessment, ego, and miscalculation provided the very survival Britain needed. Historians have speculated endlessly about what might have happened had the order not been given. If German tanks had continued their advance, the evacuation would have likely failed, and the British expeditionary force could have been annihilated. The political, military, and symbolic implications would have been profound. With the army destroyed, Britain's ability to resist invasion would have been crippled, the morale of the nation shattered, and the course of the war in Europe possibly altered forever. The controversy surrounding the Halt Order lies in the fact that no single document fully explains why it was given. It may have been a mixture of caution over terrain, confidence in air power, ego and ambition, and perhaps political calculation. What is certain is that the order created a pause in the fighting that allowed one of the most remarkable evacuations in military history to take place. Dunkirk is remembered often as a retreat, but in reality it was a race against time, a desperate effort to save an army that had no hope of victory without intervention from a decision that came from the other side of the battlefield. The Halt Order teaches us that wars are not only won by force of arms or strategy, sometimes they are won or lost because of hesitation or pause by those who hold power at the critical moment. In late May 1940, a pause lasting less than 72 hours gave Britain a chance to survive, and the Allies the opportunity to fight another day. A single command from far away shaped the future of Europe and changed the course of the Second World War in ways that continue to fascinate historians and captivate anyone who studies the fragile line between victory and defeat. From the German perspective, Dunkirk appeared to be the inevitable conclusion of a brilliant campaign. The tanks had driven hundreds of kilometers, the infantry had swept through towns and villages, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. It looked as if the Allied forces were cornered with no hope of escape. Yet, what the Germans did not see was the extraordinary resilience and improvisation of the soldiers trapped on the beaches. They had anticipated surrender or annihilation, yet what they witnessed instead was determination, courage, and a desperate will to survive. British officers organized men into units despite chaos. French soldiers worked alongside their allies to maintain order. Small groups waded into the water, dragging stretchers and makeshift rafts to carry the wounded toward boats. Every available vessel was pressed into service. The Navy coordinated destroyers and minesweepers to shuttle men across the channel while fishing. Boats, yachts, merchant ships, and even private pleasure craft navigated under fire to rescue those in the water. The beaches were a scene of controlled chaos. Men stood ankle-deep in water for hours, waiting, their faces streaked with sand, sweat, and fear. Yet their discipline held a fragile order. Every time a ship arrived, a wave of soldiers surged forward, ready to board with as little delay as possible. Artillery units dragged their guns to the edge of the evacuation zone, covering the soldiers as best they could. Engineers cleared rubble and repaired docks. Temporary piers were constructed under bombing raids. All of this was done under a constant threat of air attack. German aircraft continued to bomb, strafing the shore, dropping bombs on ships and soldiers alike, but miscalculations in bombing runs, poor coordination, and the skill of British fighter pilots prevented the Luftwaffe from inflicting decisive damage. Each attack caused panic, but never complete collapse. The more the Germans attacked, the more the soldiers adapted. They formed new lines, moved wounded soldiers away from danger improvised signals. Guided boats in and out, and despite exhaustion, continued the evacuation almost like clockwork. The Halt Order created a window that allowed these actions to succeed. Every hour of delay on the German side translated into lives saved on the Allied side. The soldiers and sailors could not know why the enemy had stopped. They could only capitalize on the unexpected reprieve. It became clear to British commanders that the pause was a gift they had not earned, but one they could not waste. Opération Dynamo escalated with remarkable speed. Day after day, thousands of men were ferried across the channel in waves. That seemed endless. Civilians contributed with an almost unimaginable courage, navigating dangerous waters to rescue strangers. The total number of soldiers evacuated began to rise dramatically. By the second day, the beaches were crowded, but movement was steady. British morale improved as word spread that ships were arriving consistently. Commanders realized that a corps of the army could survive. The city itself was under bombardment fires, and smoke created an apocalyptic scene. Yet, amidst the destruction, the operation continued almost miraculously. The Germans could see the smoke, the bombs, the ships leaving, but they did not grasp the scale of what was happening. They assumed panic would paralyze the soldiers, or that the Luftwaffe would eventually destroy enough of the evacuation effort to make it irrelevant. They underestimated the ingenuity of the British and their allies. The improvisation and sheer determination to survive was something that could not be calculated by generals or predicted by intelligence reports. The beaches of Dunkirk became a stage of human endurance. The evacuation was chaotic, dangerous, and fraught with uncertainty, yet it moved forward with astonishing efficiency. Soldiers who might have been captured or killed found themselves in boats heading for Britain. Families and civilians watched from the Channel side as the operation unfolded. Every successful crossing reinforced the possibility of survival and emboldened those still waiting. Every hour of German hesitation had turned a hopeless situation into a strategic lifeline. What the Germans did not understand was that this pause in their advance had created a psychological shift. Men who were exhausted, afraid, and demoralized now found courage and hope. They knew the enemy was near, but they also knew that rescue was within reach. The air raids that continued to pound the area no longer seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. They were dangers to be mitigated, not signals of inevitable defeat. The combination of pause and action transformed Dunkirk from a trap into an evacuation miracle. By the time the German advance resumed, the evacuation had gathered momentum. Thousands had already been carried to safety, and the soldiers remaining on the beaches were better organized, ready to board, and able to defend themselves from strafing attacks. The Germans had underestimated the human spirit, underestimated the ability to adapt and survive in the face of overwhelming odds. They had assumed victory was assured, and yet the very decision that seemed logical to them had created the conditions for the British Army to survive a defeat. On the battlefield was transformed into a moral and strategic victory through organization, improvisation, and the ability to act decisively. The lessons of Dunkirk reveal that in war, human initiative and resilience can exploit even the smallest errors or pauses by the enemy, and that the consequences of hesitation on one side can become the salvation of the other. In late May 1940, Dunkirk was not merely a retreat, it was a testament to how quickly fortune can turn when courage, improvisation, and timing intersect with the mistakes of the opponent. What if the Halt Order had never been issued? What if German tanks had continued their relentless advance toward Dunkirk? The answer is chilling and almost unimaginable, the beaches that now seemed alive with desperate determination would have been overrun in hours, perhaps even minutes. The meticulously organized evacuation would have collapsed into chaos. Ships attempting to dock would have been destroyed or blocked by the tide of soldiers trapped on. These sand thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, would have been captured or killed. The British expeditionary force would have ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The implications for Britain and the war in Europe are profound. Without the core of its professional army, Britain would have been left defenseless against a potential invasion. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of Britain, would have faced minimal resistance. The Royal Navy and Home Guard could not have compensated for the loss of trained soldiers. Morale in the country would have plummeted, and political pressure for negotiation or surrender might have intensified. Churchill, despite his determination and leadership, could have faced overwhelming pressure to seek terms with Hitler. The psychological impact of losing an entire army cannot be overstated. An army is not just numbers and weapons, it is the symbol of a nation's will to fight. The destruction of the British expeditionary force might have convinced the world that Germany was invincible, that resistance was futile, and that the Axis powers would dominate Europe unchecked strategically. The loss of the army would have prevented Britain from launching operations in North Africa or later contributing to the invasion of Italy. Without trained troops, Britain's capacity to influence the broader war would have been crippled. The Allies might have lost the initiative permanently, and the eventual liberation of Western Europe in 1944 could have been delayed or even rendered impossible, even as the men on the beaches faced annihilation. They acted with remarkable composure and courage. Each hour of the German pause allowed leaders to coordinate evacuations. Every day a ship crossed the channel. It saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. The improvisation of sailors, civilians, and soldiers together transformed a hopeless situation into a manageable one. But had the tanks moved forward, there would have been no time for improvisation, no room for coordination. Every mistake, every delay, every bottleneck would have been fatal in addition to the physical destruction. The psychological impact on the remaining population in Britain would have been severe. The nation would have faced despair and a sense of inevitable defeat. The Halt Order, however unintended or mysterious, created the window that turned despair into hope. It was not merely a pause in fighting, but a shift in the trajectory of the war. The order preserved the professional core of the army, preserved morale, and allowed Britain to continue resisting Hitler's advances. The soldiers who survived Dunkirk would later serve in campaigns across the world. They would be present in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Without the survival of this force, the story of Allied resistance would have been fundamentally different. Every plan for counteroffensive would have required starting from scratch, and time would have been on Germany's side. The Halt Order shows that in war, sometimes the most decisive moments are not the ones with the most action, but the ones where action is withheld. A single pause created consequences that shaped history far beyond what anyone at the time could have imagined. Historians often speculate on alternate timelines. What might have happened if Hitler's tanks had surged forward, if the Luftwaffe alone had been left to strike? If the evacuation had failed, the results are sobering. Europe might have fallen entirely under Nazi control. Britain's ability to wage war and rally international support could have collapsed the delay that seemed like a small tactical pause, allowed not just men to escape, but a nation to survive it allowed. Churchill, to continue to lead it, allowed the Allies to regroup, train, and prepare for campaigns that would ultimately push back the Axis. The Halt Order serves as a stark reminder that decisions in war are never simple and that hesitation can be as powerful as action. It created a paradox where inaction became the key to survival and allowed the impossible to become reality at Dunkirk. What seemed like retreat became a lesson in strategy, human resilience, and the unpredictable consequences of choices made under pressure. The course of World War II was irrevocably altered by a single order, a decision that preserved life, hope, and ultimately the chance for victory. Dunkirk is often remembered as a retreat, a desperate withdrawal under fire, yet it was far more than that. It was a turning point shaped not by spectacular victories or brilliant tactics, but by a combination of courage, improvisation, and the consequences of a single decision, a decision that halted the German advance and allowed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to escape and continue the fight. History has often overlooked this moment, focusing on later battles or ground offensives, yet the survival of the British expeditionary force at Dunkirk set the stage for every Allied campaign that followed. The beaches of northern France that May and June were filled with chaos and destruction, yet within that chaos emerged organization and hope. Soldiers waded through water, pushed through mud, and boarded ships that carried them back to Britain. Civilians took to their boats, braving bombs and gunfire, to ferry men to safety. Officers coordinated movements, improvised signals, guided vessels. And despite exhaustion and fear, the evacuation continued almost miraculously. Each hour of delay granted by the German Halt Order translated directly into lives saved. Men who would have been lost to capture or death were now preparing to fight again in Africa, Italy, and eventually Normandy. The decision to halt, whether motivated by caution over confidence or political calculation, became a pivot upon which the fate of Britain and the Allies turned. Without it, the army might have been destroyed, morale shattered, and the nation forced to seek terms with Hitler. Yet, because it survived, Britain retained a fighting force capable of resisting invasion and inspiring global support. The psychological impact was enormous. The knowledge that an army had been saved, that men had been brought home from almost certain destruction, reinforced the resolve of a nation. Winston Churchill described Dunkirk as a miracle, and while he was careful in his words, the event was no accident. It was the product of countless acts of bravery, skill, and quick thinking combined with the peculiarities of decision-making on the other side of the battlefield. The Germans, confident in their victory, could not foresee the human resilience that would transform their pause into a strategic disaster. The Luftwaffe's failure to destroy the evacuation convoys, the adaptability of soldiers under fire, the courage of civilians, all these factors converged in a moment that could have been catastrophic, but instead became pivotal as the evacuation concluded. More than 338,000 soldiers had been rescued. The British Army retained its professional corps, the backbone of future campaigns. The Allies had preserved the means to regroup, retrain, and eventually counterattack. The pause granted by the Halt Order created a bridge between imminent defeat and continued resistance. It was a window through which history shifted. Dunkirk serves as a reminder that wars are not decided solely by numbers or firepower. Sometimes the most consequential moments are the ones in which action is withheld, the decision to halt, a pause lasting less than 72 hours, allowed a trapped army to survive, morale to endure, and a nation to continue fighting. The lessons of Dunkirk extend beyond military strategy. They teach about timing, human resilience, and the unpredictable consequences of decisions made under pressure. A single pause, a single order, altered the course of the Second World War in ways that still resonate today. What seemed like retreat became an emblem of survival, a testament to the power of preparation, courage, and the unexpected benefits of hesitation. History might forget the details of the Halt Order, but it cannot forget its consequences. The beaches of Dunkirk were more than sand and water. They were a crucible in which survival, stratégie, and fortune intersected. A nation was saved not because of a brilliant victory, but because of a momentary pause, a forgotten turning point that changed the course of the war and preserved the hope, the courage, and the fighting force that would one day help liberate Europe.